Welcome to Inspiring STEM's podcast program celebrating innovations in scientific publishing and science communications. We are interviewing key opinion leaders and organisations working to advance and quite often to disrupt the status quo. My name is Martin Delhanty and I will be your host. In this week's episode, I'm chatting with David Ross, who is a publishing consultant with over 30 years' experience in academic research and educational sectors. Up until last year, he was Vice President Open Research at Sage Publishing for nearly 10 years and has also worked with Kluwer Academic, Arnold Publications and Chapman and Hall. David specialises in open science publishing and the transition to more open modes of research communication. A very warm welcome, David, to the programme.
Hello, and thank you for having me on.
And maybe just to begin, it'd be nice if you could give us a little bit background to your career in publishing and how it all started. Such a long time ago, hard to remember, really. Yeah, I mean, basically, I graduated in the early 90s. I actually studied manufacturing engineering. And kind of the only thing I knew I didn't want to do at the end of that was be a manufacturing engineer. So at that point, I just started looking around for other opportunities. One thing led to another. I did some cash in hand work actually for Verso, which is the publisher of the New Left Review, and that gave me a bit of a taste for publishing. And then it's just one of those fortuitous situations. The first, I was in that mode of applying for any job I could possibly get interviewed for, and very kindly, a man called Michael Dunn, Chapman and Hall, gave me an interview for a material science assistant editor for material science program, and offered me the job. And that was it, really. One of those things. And then just found myself in this industry, which I loved. It's it's a very people-centric industry. I remember even in the early days, would be, as a jobbing commissioning editor, my job was to go around. This was sort of commissioning textbooks, engineering textbooks. My job was to go around the country, talking to the brightest people in their fields, trying to get them persuaded to write books for me, and just really, really fell in love with it. And then, then there is those points in your career where you reflect on what you're doing, and is it something you want to do for the rest of your life? And yeah, there's always the idea that you're involved in the dissemination of scholarly knowledge, as opposed to the production of widgets in an industrial state, which is what I was trained to do. Yeah, very much appealed to me. Yeah, and kept me satisfied. And from there, I had an opportunity to go and work in America for a couple of years for Kluwer. That was a classic case of working for a company who got bought by another company and relocating me to the US, and that was a fantastic opportunity. And then came back and found myself at Sage Publications, as it was called then. It's now Sage Publishing. And that's how I got involved with Open Access. I became, I think because I was their STM commissioning senior editor for journals, I then naturally became the person who got involved in the Open Access scene, and that started to develop to become a separate business model. And that's been the last 15 years, really. I suppose that was it. I was a founding board member of OASPA, so that's where it all started. Yeah. I think, both of us probably had the same entry point for publishing, not with the same publisher, but 30 years again, and the same kind of trajectory. And it certainly would be fair to say that over the last 10, 15 years, maybe just over the last 10 years, that open access publishing has been truly disruptive. So maybe you could sort of share with us how you see the significant achievements over that time period and how they came about.
Yeah, the achievements, it depends who you talk to about this side. I think the obvious achievement now is that, putting an exact number on it's hard, but let's say, somewhere around about 50% of all research articles are made available open access. Now that is a kind of a mixture of green and gold, so deposit of author executive manuscripts or actual gold OA publishing under a CC license. But yeah, 50% of content is open access. Now, some people will say that's been pretty slow going, given it was 20 years ago since the sort of Budapest and Berlin declarations that really kind of kick-started this thing. But I think what I'd say is if you look at what's happened in the last 5 or so years, then it has really started to accelerate, and that's one of the bigger or the most recent advances, and that has predominantly been driven by funders. I mean, when I started in the OA world and started moving in that kind of space, everyone began to realise that there was an adage: nothing's going to change until the funders get involved. And then, lo and behold, the funders, in the shape of Coalition S signatories, in the shape of the NIH and OSTP oversight, they started sort of really pushing for this, and things really started to change. So that's been the key thing. Now, again, and if you look, there might have been a slow start, but if you look at the curve of OA, certainly over the last, I would say, 5 years, there's been this rapid acceleration. I think what goes with that is that certainly in the kind of funded, let's call it biomedical sciences for sake of argument, and funded sciences, I think there's a sense that it's inevitable that all research will be free to read. You have to be careful with labels, if you like, because is that open access? Now, a lot of people, the purists would say that open access it's only open access if it's published under a Creative Commons license. So if it's just out there free to read without a reusability allowance, then it's not real open access. But again, that's very much labels. But I think that's inevitable. I mean, it's dangerous to talk about tipping points. I don't like talking about tipping points, but I certainly think when you look back on this where we are now in sort of 10 years' time, you'll see this is very much the beginning of the reality of it finally becoming real, that all funded research is going to be published open access. Whether it's under a APC funded Gold OA model or some other model is more open to debate. So,
but as you say, it took the funders to group together collaboratively under Coalition S to ultimately force the disruption that we're currently seeing in publishing, and we'll come on to talk about the Transformative agreements as an example of the disruptive business model amongst all the traditional academic publishers. But as you say, it's just been extraordinary to see what Coalition S has achieved in a relatively short period of time. Yet there seems to have been a threshold above which the number of funders supporting hasn't moved probably since the first iteration of Coalition S, and I wonder why we're not seeing more funders sort of joining Coalition S or creating other similar groupings.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt the Coalition has had an impact, a significant one. But someone quite heavily involved in it at the right beginning about Plan S. Plan S isn't really a plan. It was more a signal, a push to the market to get its act together, to actually make this happen. So I think it's been less about getting some kind of critical mass of actual funders together to marshal it. But even there are many library consortia, for example, who aren't necessarily signatories to Coalition S, but they very much believe in the principles that they've laid out. They're very much behind what they're trying to do. So, and even in Coalition S's constitution, if you like, for want of a better word, the signatories don't have to follow everything it says they're telling them that they want to do, but it's more about a philosophy of actually trying to move the market forward. So, yeah, I think for various internal national political reasons, there's been some issues. Funders can't sign up to Coalition S and become, signatories. There have been one or two select occasions where they've actually withdrawn, but I don't think that matters so much. It matters more that they, whenever you talk to them, to people in that, stakeholders on that side, they do very much believe in the principles of what they're trying to do, even if they don't believe in the actual detail of what they're trying to do. So that's been the secret of their success. I don't think they need to have every funder. Well, clearly, don't need to have every funder in the world signed up to the plan to make it real. That was never the intention, I don't think.
And do you think the original intention was to kill the subscription model? And is that the case? Is the subscription model dying?
Yeah, I mean, if you want my personal opinion, I think it is, with some caveats. Um, yeah, I mean, if you go back to sort of one of the other things that's quite an achievement, if you like, on the other side, it is quite an achievement that the subscription model is still surviving to this day, and is still the predominant way of delivering scholarly research. Given everything that's gone on, since basically the invention of the internet, it's quite staggering that still remains the predominant way of delivering it. But that talks to many different inertias in the system. Some of that from the publishing side, a lot of it from the academic community. The academic community generally wants to publish in journals or they want to publish where their community will find it and where they will get some kind of credentialization for it and authentication of it. And they have been traditional journals. So most, if you like, are not that involved in the ideological debates about openness and paywalls, etc. And then there's a lot of inertia in the academic credentialism system or assessment system as well. So that's why it's still there. But yeah, I think, as you said, we'll come on to transformative agreements. But I think that's where it is still the only way you can deliver the volumes of academic research that are being published at the moment without a fundamental shift of the money supply within the system. Now, there's been various people, over the years who have said, Ralph Schimmer of Max Planck being one of them, there's enough money in the system to enable the shift, but the shift still has to be made, and that's very much a change from funding sources to library sources, and then how that actually played out takes time as much as anything else. And I do think that, particularly coming from Sage Publications, and there is a fundamental issue here with non-funded research as well. I mean, I do think one of the successes of the OA movement over the last 5-10 years has been there's an inevitability about this now, but there is still quite an unanswered question about what happens, how you fund non-funded research, or non-direct funded research, I should say. Most of the humanities and social sciences, where there isn't grant money flowing around in order to pay APCs. How is that? Publishing costs money. Anyone that understands the publishing scholarly research cycle understands that publishing costs money. So how do you fund that? And that's a real challenge. And I do think, in the broader sense, advocates do tend to just brush over that and are willing to throw it under a bus, maybe. It's only 10% the output, it's only 10% the funding. Let's not worry about that. Let's focus on the 90% of the funded research that we must make free to read. But yeah, there is an unanswered question, I think, from anyone's point of view, of how you fund the publication of everything else.
And I think, to that point, what certainly I've seen and I think I've witnessed is a very healthy discussion around the cost of publishing, and the fact there is, as you say, a cost of publishing, but to transition away from the focus on cost and price to value-based propositions, and for publishers to engender the value which they curate in helping to curate, moderate, share, disseminate, report on content on behalf of the scientific community, and lots of really good, healthy, maybe more ideological discussions around publishers being the custodians for academic science and wanting to contribute to the academic scientific endeavor by having that value-based role. So I think Coalition S has certainly been a stick to be, let's face it, big publishers to move towards the transition to open access, whereas free to access or fully open access under CC BY. I've certainly been shot down a number of times by saying that there's a range of open access options under Creative Commons licenses for somebody to say no, there's only one option, which is the CC BY, the ultimate free to reuse.
Well, yeah,
taking down the commercial barriers.
Yeah, the real purists say CC0, not even BY. It should just be out there. I don't necessarily believe in that, but I've been to a number of people who have argued quite passionately that CC0 is the only real open access. There should be,
we won't mention names, but imagine who it might be. You mentioned the subject-based, differential, between the clinical biomedical sciences, life sciences, and then social science, humanities in terms of funding. But then there's also regional differences as well. What has your experience been with regional differences and approaches to open access?
I mean, I think you have to look at it, for whatever reasons. It was the Northern European consortia and funding agencies that really started pushing this forward, and that was, you can see that through the makeup of things like Coalition S. But more, even individually, the University consortia have been, pushing for read and publish agreements, which, I'll come back to that and how they morphed into transformative agreements. But that's been going on. But it's been very much a Northern European push until now. But then, immediately the people who listen to this going, well, what about the NIH in the US? Because the NIH mandate, public access mandate, has been around for decades, and that's probably one of the most effective open access mandates, if you like. But again, not true open access because it's not under any licensing agreements, and also for many, it's been under a 12-month embargo. So you kind of got those two, but the big sort of unspoken here is China, really, at the moment, in terms of they're not the only region or country that hasn't really pushed for this, but obviously by far the largest in terms of the research output. There seems to be no real push in a policy level coming from China. I think for them a switch to an APC model would obviously be much more expensive because of the volumes of work coming out of China. So it's more problematic there. A lot of the Chinese universities tend to be on quite historically low subscription rates. Back to the days, you remember those when there was seen as an emerging economy. So it's difficult to see how they would push for that But again, in my experience, there is the National Natural Science Foundation, biggest funding agency in China, probably the biggest funder of APCs in the world. I don't have any facts to back that up, but they are an enormous funder of APCs for many, many journals that are the Chinese output dominated. So you got the funding agency level; they are quite committed to OA. They back OA, they allow it, they enable it. But on a policy level, there's never been anything coming out on a major front from the government there. And again, India, so the next big research powerhouse, they too, there's lots of different conversations going on there, but there's been no big sort of solid policy level. Let everything must be published open access coming out of that market. So it does tend to be a Western dominated push at the moment, and I think with transformative agreements as well, there's always a free rider issue from that point of view in terms of, and that's one of the problems with the whole read and publish model is if once everything is flipped open access, will people stop paying for their subscription anymore? They enable the actual the publish aspect part of it. So until you get there's going to be no global flip. That's an impossibility. It's not. This isn't a thing in a moment in time that can just happen. So there's going to have to be leaders and fast followers and people, and there will always be some free riders in this situation as well from an open access point of view, from an open free to read point of view.
And that brings us on nicely to talk about transformative agreements in themselves. And so maybe you could give a layperson's 101 on these agreements and predict, how these are going to develop over time.
Ooh, predicting is a dangerous game, but yeah. I'll have a go. So 101, these things, they start with things that, and this is simplifying it from my point of view, how I see it. They start as things called read and publish, which is very much it kind of goes back to BSNU actually. They started the push toward this, where yes, the libraries who were subscribed to journals, consortia of them got together and said, if we're going to continue to pay you this X amount of money to subscribe, to read to your material, we also want the rights to publish the research. It comes out of our institutions for free, or actually to begin with, for a little bit of money. We're going to pay you a bit of money for the right to publish the stuff that you publish from our institutions. Alongside, but not at any sort of real cost plus model, but just because we're spending oftentimes millions of dollars, or pounds, or euros on your subscriptions, then we also want the right to publish but only from our institutions, and that was the read and publish model. And there was always a view that they were then going to kind of morph into a publish and read model, if you like, in the sums of money that were actually being paid, where it became more about predominantly paying for the publication output, almost a per article rate to publish. But only the materials being published within their institution or country that they're representing, and then there'll be a small fee that would be attached to reading everything else. So that was the shift from read and publish to publish and read. And that was a mechanism which, back in the day, people felt was going to enable, if all subscribers sort of started demanding those kind of deals, whether it be at consortial level or institute level, then that would be a way for the world to migrate to a world where everything was freely available, to read. And also back to the question about unfunded research, that does actually provide some mechanism for unfunded research to be published, because it's not the funding money that's flowing here. It's basically a reappropriation of reallocation of the subscription money, which does provide some kind of funding for unfunded research. So that's sort of where it started and where again, but that, I think it's probably safe to say that many people felt that was taking too long. It wasn't happening in a broadly enough for it to have a global impact. So that's where the idea of a transformative agreement came in, and that was very much was a language born out of Plan S, and that was, I think, probably best characterised as more of a push to say we're only willing to continue with these read and publish agreements, the people that pay the bills, the library consortia, if you, the publisher, is willing to commit to the fact that these are transforming. This isn't we're not stuck in this read and publish model, or even a publish and read model, which just at a national level you have to commit to demonstrating that you are going to transform your entire portfolio, or even subset your portfolio, into proper open access publication models. And that's where the word transformative came in. And I do believe, someone probably correct me on this, but I do think that was coined by Coalition S itself when it allowed hybrid journals. And again, so just the people that don't know, a hybrid journal is a subscription journal that allows an author to choose to make their article open access for an additional fee, for quite a large fee most of the time, rather than a pure subscription journal doesn't allow that. A hybrid journal does allow that. And so Coalition S made it acceptable for academics to publish in hybrid journals as long as they were part of the Transformative Agreement. So as long as the publishers of those journals agreed or committed to at some point transforming those journals or transitioning those journals to full open access models. And I think to a certain extent that was done on a pragmatic level, a tactical level of we can't, if people had said to the academic community, you cannot publish in all of these subscription journals, even if they're hybrid, from now on, there would have been uproar in the academic community, and I think it would not have served the greater goal that well. So they did make this allowance to allow hybrid journals as an interim stage. And I think that's the key here, as an interim stage. They have to be seen to be, not even seen to be, they have to actually be in the act of transforming. So I think that's kind of where we are. And I think a lot of people feel that's kind of now where we're stuck a bit, because they're not, greater and greater proportions of these journal packages are open access, but it's still very difficult to see how they're actually going to get to a point, in the transformative journals world, where once you get to 70-75%, you must commit to flipping them open access. But not that many journals or anything like that quantity. They may well be 40-50%, but they're not that many. They're getting near 70. So if you want to start getting the crystal ball out, I do think there's going to be a reckoning, if you like. And coming back to Coalition S, they did acknowledge that earlier this year that I think after 2024, transformative agreements and transformative journals will no longer be compliant. They did notably also say that it will effectively be down to the individual signatory funders to decide how to implement that. So I don't think you're going to see a 1st of Jan 2025. That's it. Hybrid journal publication not allowed. But I do think you're going to what that is going to enable is some of the large consortia to be much more forthright in their negotiations when these agreements come up for renewal. And I think you are going to get to a point, perhaps not in this renewal cycle, the first renewal cycle, but in subsequent renewal cycles, of which generally are every 2 or 3 years, you're going to get a much higher level of militancy now the consortium saying, well, if you're not transforming your journals, then we're not doing this. We're not going to allow this anymore. Sorry. And this isn't going to go away. We're not parked where we are now and it stops here. So I think that would be that's back to the crystal ball. It's bad. It's dangerous to make predictions, but I do think in, let's say, 4 or 5 years' time, that you're going to start to see either a big flip of these journal packages to open access, or actually some of them getting frozen out, and people not being willing to resubscribe to them. And there's already people have shown the willingness to that already.
Yeah, and we talked earlier on about regional differences, and one of my findings is that the observations is that the transformative agreements currently in place, the big transformative agreements for the large consortia in Germany and rest of Europe, for example, are weighted towards those publishers that have a high proportion of their content originating from those countries, whereas for regional players with more focus on South America or on Asia Pacific region, they have the challenge in that the proportion of authors from Europe is relatively low. So achieving the hurdle required by Coalition S is very difficult. I know publishers have looked to join transformative deals as a means of opening up those journals to acquiring more authors from Europe. So it's an editorial strategy rather than a business strategy. And so what they're looking for is, if you like, an equitable relationship with the consortia, where the consortia are promoting these more regional journals outside of Europe as publication vehicles, part of a transformative deal, doing the right thing, but as a good, credible publication vehicle for authors within Europe. And they're not actually seeing that. They're not seeing that sort of equitable, reciprocal marketing promotion to authors, and they're being left out. And it might play to the bigger sort of challenge around the open access paid for APC, article processing charge model, is that there's an inequity in the system. Those who can afford it can pay for it. Those who can't are excluded from it. So what are your sort of thoughts on the inherent inequity in the current business model for open access publishing?
I mean, there is one. There's no doubt about that. But it does tend to be fairly well offset by the waiver policies that the vast majority of, certainly the commercial or the large non-profits put in place, where in a sense, the people use a different, systems, whether it's Research for Life or whether it's the World Bank categories, but they do basically waive publications, fees from all other low-income countries, with some notable exceptions. So that inequity is is definitely addressed there, but it's not perfect. Benefits from imagination. I think your point about it being difficult for other journals in other regional journals to attract European content, or even American content for that matter, is being made harder by these transformative agreements, because now, Northern European authors can publish in the journals they've always published in, because their big libraries tend to have negotiated these deals, read and publish deals, with all the big publishers, so they can merrily go and publish over here, satisfy the requirements of their funders, and not look elsewhere. So that they are embedding the existing inequity in that sense, or the existing bias. And as an aside, that's also having an impact on the growth of pure OA journals, because the push to publish in a pure OA journal is being diminished for authors from Northern Europe and America and the US, because they can publish in the journals they've always published in the past. So that slowed the growth of what people saw another mechanism of kind of displacing the existing model. I think there is a quite a fundamental philosophical debate about you're replacing one next thing. We're now in a pay-to-play model, and that inherently favours those that can afford to pay. I have a slightly, I think the scholarly communication system itself is aware of this enough that it will over time put enough checks and balances in place to enable people from low-income countries to publish, but there's no denying that it is continuing to embed the existing inequity just in the research infrastructure, which is heavily biased towards the rich country in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. And we've talked about the disruptive aspect to open access publishing and open science. Another, I think, innovation that we've seen is these born open access publications and publishers, whether it's MDPI or Frontiers, Hindawi, and then more, getting into disruptive, for example, peer review models that we're seeing with eLive. And coming back to maybe thinking about ethical problems and whether there's ethical problems associated with pay to publish, maybe you could sort of expand a little bit more on that, and maybe what is your view on, for example, the eLive new peer review model, which is effectively publishing everything that's submitted.
Well, for a correction, they don't publish everything that's submitted. They still have a desktop system where they select what it is.
I should qualify that. Yes, absolutely.
They want to get the review, but they are. Once that is done, you're effectively in a kind of more of an open peer review system of a preprint. It's slightly championed by F1000, but they've taken it to another level. I'll come back to that, because I think that's a slightly different thing. I think there's two things going on here, and what that is about the changing nature of peer review itself, regardless of the system that it's done under, and of course that has the mechanism for paying for it is inherent to it, but that's about changing nature of peer review. Whereas the ethical issues, and I'm not sure there's I'd use the term ethical when it comes to OA publishing. There are ethical problems with it per se. I think what there is a conflict of interest. There is no doubt about it. If your revenue, particularly as a commercial entity, but that's it for most not-for-profits that are involved heavily in publishing. But if your revenues are connected to the amount of articles you publish, then of course there is a push. There's an inherent conflict of interest there, because you're going to want to publish more. I think that's easily, but so easily is not that you can deal with that by having the right safeguards in place, like having robust editorial practices in place, having independent decision making again, I was just say independent peer review because I'm not sure that is necessarily the case, the solution. You have to have an independent, non-commercial decision being made along the process. So as long as you've got lots of checks and safety valves in place, then you can manage that conflict of interest. But as we have seen, most recently, with the Wiley and Dowie, but previously before that, it's been sometimes those safeguards fail and stuff gets through. But then that's publishers doing their job properly when they find this stuff, they find things that are going wrong, and every publisher has retracted many articles for these things. Then this is how the system's supposed to work. We are, publishers are the custodians of the version of record. Historically, anyway, that's been their role. So these are just corrections of the market, and I see that in a sense as a functioning market, not as some sort of huge ethical issue. How this sort of impacts on on the nature of peer review is sort of slightly more interesting, because I think that might have more of a long-term impact on exactly the scholarly communications system itself, and I think that's what ELIFE are trying to do. I don't particularly have any real insight into exactly what ELIFE are up to, but from what I read about it and what I see they're doing, they're some people see preprints as the end point here. And everyone agrees with this, and they don't have to, and I don't actually agree with it. But some people think that that's where we will end up being, that people should just submit the preprints, put them out there, publish them, put them on the internet, and then let people assess them. Have them, and in Eli's model, I think is better than. I don't believe in a slap it up there and let the crowd decide model, because I think that way lies madness. Just from an information overload point of view, we're all looking for filters in everything else we do in our life, and fundamentally, a journal historically provides a filter. So why you then just slap it up there and just let everyone have a look and decide whether it's valuable or not? I don't agree with that. And again, back to non-data driven subjects, you have to have someone deciding whether it's important, valid, worth publishing, because it's not an objective assessment. So they're trying a different model, which is back to the funders, if you like. ELIFE is funded by the funders, and they're trying to just try in different ways of actually getting the peer review system to work. So that's in a sense an extreme version of it, and I'm surprised at the sort of the attacks they've been getting for just trying out this, because I think it's quite a reasonable thing they're trying to do. But then beyond that, there is the nature of peer review, I think, is changing in general away from this highly selective community-based view driven, centered around a journal. The peer review was never one thing anyway, but the general accepted gold standard was a minimum of 2 independent peer reviewers would make an assessment. People who understood in the field would make an assessment, and then editor-in-chief. But all independently done by the academic community itself, within the community. That's because of the volumes being published these days. That's no longer sustainable. So the fact that some of this is being brought in-house by some publishers and managed, and they provide the basic peer review function, as long as an external third-party academic who understands the field makes a final decision on this, then I think that is a different kind of peer review than some people would talk about, but it's still a perfectly valid way of managing peer review, given what we're. And you'll always have the highly selected journals. You're always going to have the natures and the sciences of this world, and that's fine, because they're providing an extra filter, and it's good for them. But I think to handle the volumes these days, I think you have to accept that it's not going to be done in quite the same way as it has been historically.
No, and certainly the pandemic. Talking about preprints, the pandemic is sort of been an advent for bioRxiv and medRxiv, with the publication of COVID-related preprint papers in advance of even the speediest publishing within Lancet or Nature Medicine, and it certainly contributed to the advancement of the vaccine and vaccines and public health management. So it's certainly it's been a super booster for that model. But I think what's really healthy about the publishing ecosystem at the moment is that you have a diversity of models, inputs and outputs, and central to that is the data problem, and the big data problem is that there's so much data there, and now so much metadata and persistent identifiers being embedded into this body of content that we need to apply filters to make sense of that. And of course, one of the filters that we're all looking at the moment is ChatGPT, and how that makes sense of the corpus of academic and scholarly research still up until 2021, I think. So it's missing a couple of years of
for now.
Millions of articles. But what are your sort of thoughts on machine learning, AI, and don't need to mention ChatGPT specifically, but it's difficult not to.
I'm terrified is generally would be my main thought there. So I think that's going to be a huge challenge. I'd like to just return to one thing, one point you made around particularly what research. I mean, we knew this before, but what COVID, the research coming out of COVID times, it's the speed of things. I'm not by anything I just said by any means defending the old school version of peer review. It takes far too long. In this day and age, it cannot take that long. It's absolutely absurd that a paper that that contains a fundamentally valuable information for society, can sit there 9 months in peer review. I mean, it's not acceptable. It's just, that has to change. And again, that is what a lot of people, there's a big push coming from that side. And that is where preprints do have, I think, a part to play in it. But also, if you look at some of the more radical, some of the born OA publishers who are doing things much, much faster than the traditional publishers, traditional literature publishers, there's something to learn from that as well. Because, it can't, I think, regardless of pushing for the funders' side, because then the taxpayer paid for this, it should be free to read, which is obviously quite a strong philosophical argument. There's also this is fundamental scientific information that's important for the world. We need to find a way to get it out faster. So I think that is also what's going to drive the changing nature of peer review. And back to the sort of the big data side. Let's think of the big data side. I mean, again, making predictions is a dangerous game. But if I were to make one, I do think for the data-heavy subjects, the biomedical subjects, I think the nature of actually scholarly communication is going to change, and I think it might change quicker than people think it might. It will. I think it becomes data, and then commentary around the data. The sort of the need for, I know some people disagree on this, but I think the need for a narrative paper, an article that sits around that to explain it, and becomes redundant. It's the data that matters, and all sorts of other elements around that. So that becomes the main point of communication with a bit of commentary. Is probably what will change. But that can only be true of data-driven subjects. Obviously, for qualitative subjects, you still need the narrative. I mean, as for ChatGPT, I mean, it's not my area of expertise by any stretch of imagination, but that's back to, I think you have to have, there has to be human beings involved in the process for this reason, for no other, for this reason. The idea of AI peer review terrifies me. Not in of itself, I don't think you could basically judge the structure of a methodology section using AI. I think you probably could. And it would be a lot faster, like almost instantaneous. So that's a positive. But if you then, one thing we haven't mentioned in all this is the fraudulent activity, encompassed by what are called paper mills, who are very sophisticated, multi-million, if not billion-pound industries here. The idea that you could then have a system where you had AI-generated papers which would then be peer-reviewed by AI and which would then be published as a real thing, I mean, that's a very real risk in all of this. It happens, I would put money on it happening today at a very small scale level. More, not so much on the AI peer review, but these AI-generated papers getting through the weak peer review systems. So the idea that terrifies me. And for me, the only way you stop that is having some human beings involved in the process to make sure to sit down and give it a sanity check, and that will always have its inherent faults. There'll always be biases in that, but there'll always be failures. But no one's come up with a better way of doing it yet. And with what's on the horizon, I think, that becomes more important than it ever has before.
Yeah, well, what's nice, yes, from the publishing community, but also from the AI community, what's being emphasized is the human intervention, the human curation on top of using AI tools. Fantastic. It's there. It's already there. It's already being used, we know, for good and perhaps malevolent activity, because it's cheap and easy and quite powerful to use. But the human intervention is still critical to the scientific endeavor and to publishing. And it's about re-emphasizing that, but also being aware of the tools that are out there and skilling up. I've worked with a number of people on looking already at setting up training skills on large language models like ChatGPT, but there are many others out there, and understanding how to use them productively within a publishing context, and to then be aware of the potential fraudulent or misuse of those tools. And it's nice also to see, I'm seeing in the United States where, already colleges in the States are not banning ChatGPT, but already saying you must use ChatGPT to create your essays, because we know you're going to use it, but we're going to provide training and education about how to use it. And of course, they're changing the curriculum models as well. So, they're having to adapt very, very quickly. So the genie's out of the bottle, I'm afraid. So
It definitely is. I think one of the most optimistic ways of looking at that, more in the sort of teaching world, is that it's going to have to come back to an assessment of critical thinking. We anyway, grew up in this world where it was all about outputs. Literally, from sitting in those exam rooms churning out essays within 3 hours, answering papers, whatever it was. In a sense, that model's no longer feasible anymore. It's no fit for purpose. So I think teaching students, undergraduates, how to critically assess stuff and actually how to critically and communicate at a more individual, immediate level, that's very powerful. That's better. And then that you could see that come sort of filling in, extending to general research. That's back to nothing. People say nothing would change until the funders get involved, but also nothing's really going to change until the way an academic is assessed changes. And currently they're still assessed by how many papers they publish in which journals. And perhaps the which journals bits is changing a bit, but it's still how many papers they published or what paper they published where. And until that changes, fundamentally none of this really changes. But this kind of tool, as the impacts that you were just pointing out in an academic, undergraduate, in postgraduate setting, has the same implications in research setting, in that context. So it's about, it should be about the research you do, not how you write it up. But again, how given the volumes of research, the quantity of research that's being done worldwide, everyone needs shortcuts and everyone needs filters, and you need a way to assess it. And back to kind of, it's still the least worst, and no one's got a better idea quite yet. Although I would imagine I'll get quite a lot of people saying, "I've got a better idea, I could do it," but not the one that works at scale.
Well, that again, I think the great thing at the moment is that the ideas out there are free flowing in the current very, very dynamic context of scholarly publishing and science communications, which makes it very exciting, dynamic, challenging, and I guess for us as consultants as well, it creates great opportunities for us to dig in deep and help out where there are those challenges. So maybe just to finish, David, where are you going to be over the next few months? What are you going to be up to?
Well, the next few days I should be at the London Book Fair. Obviously, it's great to see that back in the full Oh, I'll be interested. About last year was the first time it actually was on post-COVID, and it's still relatively sparsely attended. I felt so. Let's see what it's like this year. But I'll be there for the next 3 days. And yeah, I mean, as you said right at the beginning, I mean, this is fairly just starting out on this publishing consultancy journey. I'm talking to a few people, doing a bit of work here, and a few people already. But yeah, I'll be interested to see where it goes. I do, I think particularly what fascinates me and what I've been deeply involved in over the last 10 years, as you said, but is the whole how to actually affect a transition, particularly for a commercial publisher or a not-for-profit that relies heavily on their journals, on their journal revenue. How you actually transition from one model to another in a financially sustainable way, and that's and I think that satisfying all the needs of the various stakeholders. So that's what's really interests me. So I'd love to use my knowledge in a more targeted way on that level, and being able to help some other publishers out on that front. And we'll see how it goes, and we'll see see how the market moves.
Great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, thank you so much, David, for a great conversation. Let's hope the London Book Fair is productive for all of us. I'm there as well this week. So thank you again for a great conversation. I'll include obviously your details and the links to the mentions in the podcast description. But for the moment, thank you, and we'll speak again soon.
Yeah, thank you again for inviting me, and I'll see you at the book fair, I'm sure. Okay.
Will do.
See you later.